Okay, let's wrap up the investigation into the endocrine and lymphatic system, and we're going to finish off by looking at common pathologies associated with the lymphatic and immune systems. So let's start by looking at acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also known as AIDS. So AIDS is not a disease you're born with, but it is an acquired disease through the human immunodeficiency virus. So this virus specifically attacks the helper T cells of the immune system. So the helper T cells are cells within our immune system that are involved in our adaptive immunity. So the loss of these helper T cells leaves the body without a coordinated defense against even minor infections. So when HIV/AIDS first emerged, it was nearly 100% fatal. And this is because we lacked the tools to stop the replication of the virus in the body. With modern medicine, we've developed the antiretroviral therapy for HIV, and this antiviral treatment has really transformed the treatment of HIV. And now it's seen as a more chronic, manageable condition. So these medications prevent the virus from multiplying, and this allows the immune system to recover, and it prevents the progression to AIDS, so to a full-blown syndrome here. Because the immune system is suppressed, people with or who have been infected develop illnesses that a healthy individual would normally fight off. So these signs and symptoms include encephalitis or meningitis, so inflammation of the brain, bad lung infections. So typically if an individual is infected with pneumonia, with proper treatment, it can be recoverable. However, individuals with HIV have a much more challenging time in fighting the infection. Also, tuberculosis is another lung infection. Unusual tumors and malignancies also develop. So because the immune system is not behaving and performing the tasks that it normally would, the individual is more susceptible to unusual growths or otherwise things that our immune system is able to suppress. So a patient therefore often suffers from extreme lethargy and weight loss because the body is trying to fight multiple infections and multiple kind of disordered states here, right? So with increased potential for unusual tumors or infections and so forth. So there are many systemic influences of this particular syndrome. And when the immune system overreacts, individuals may experience what's called autoimmune diseases. Now, normally our immune system learns to ignore our own cells and only attack foreign pathogens. An autoimmune disease happens when the immune system loses the ability to tell self cells from non-self. And our lymphocytes begin to treat our own healthy tissues as a threat. So our lymphocytes become activated against our body's own healthy antigens. Foreign pathogens and foreign cells contain antigens. These are protein surface markers that act as identifiers of the type of cell. Our own cells have antigens as well, but our body recognizes them and it doesn't detect them as foreign. Now, in an autoimmune condition, your own immune system begins to see your own cells as foreign. What happens is the production of antibodies that target your own tissues or organs occurs. And chronic activation of the immune system in this manner leads to eventual tissue damage and destruction, and therefore the loss of organ function. Often the cause is unknown, and treatment typically involves anti-inflammatory medications and also immunosuppressive medications. So medications that suppress the immune system to dampen this effect. Autoimmune diseases can be localized, such as rheumatoid arthritis, right? We've talked about this previously, where the immune system specifically targets the lining of the joints and bone within the joint. But autoimmune diseases can also be systemic, where the attack is widespread, such as what I mentioned about attacking body's tissues and organs. So if it's a systemic autoimmune condition, an example of this being lupus, the body produces autoantibodies, so auto referring to self, so autoantibodies that can attack almost any antigen or surface protein or any tissue in the body, such as what happens in lupus. So this can lead to inflammation of the skin, rashes on the skin, inflammation of the heart tissue, lung tissue, kidneys, brain tissue, all at once. So it's systemic inflammation that's occurring because your immune system is attacking your own tissues. So moving from those autoimmune failures to cellular malfunctions, here we have Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is a malignancy, so a type of cancer that begins in the lymphatic system. What happens is a lymphocyte undergoes a genetic mutation which causes it to multiply uncontrollably. And eventually it starts crowding out healthy cells and forms tumors within the lymphoid tissues. So those lymphoid organ tissues, just tissues that make up the lymphatic system. And so the most common physical sign is swelling of the lymph nodes, typically in the neck region or in the armpit. And because the immune system is being compromised, patients often experience systemic symptoms as well. As I mentioned, lymphocytes fight infection normally, but because these lymphocytes are mutated, they don't function properly. And so what does this mean for the patient if the lymphocytes aren't doing their job? As we've seen previously, if lymphocytes aren't doing their job, typically lymphocytes fight infection, and therefore the patient will experience an increased risk of infections. So in response to these lymphocytes not functioning properly, you end up forming masses or growths of T and B lymphocytes collecting in those lymphoid tissues, so the spleen, liver, especially lymph nodes. And this not only interferes with lymphocyte function, but also the function of these organs and tissues. Now let's look at infectious mononucleosis, commonly known as mono. And it's a prime example of a virus that directly hijacks the lymphatic system. So mono is caused by Epstein-Barr virus. This virus is highly contagious through saliva, and this is why it's historically been dubbed the kissing disease. So once it enters the body, it targets and infects specifically your B lymphocytes. And if we recall from earlier, your B lymphocytes are responsible for producing antibodies. Now, symptoms of mono are actually a result of your immune response to fight this infection. So as the body tries to neutralize those infected B cells, your lymph nodes, especially the ones in the neck, become severely inflamed and swollen. And they become inflamed and swollen because they try to mass produce those immune defensive cells, like lymphocytes or macrophages and so forth. And this is why patients feel extremely tired when they have mono because the energetic cost of this massive immune response is very high. One of the most dangerous complications of mono is splenomegaly, or an enlarged spleen, right? Megaly we've seen before, meaning enlarged. Because it becomes overworked, and because the spleen is a secondary lymphoid organ that filters the blood, now it can't function properly and is swollen with all the cellular debris. So if the spleen isn't functioning, then we won't see as efficient filtering of the blood and those immune responses or immune functions that the spleen performs. Because that is how many individuals were thought to have become infected with this illness, based on this reference to the kissing disease. This again comes from that notion that it is highly, highly infectious and mainly spread through saliva. So the number of lymphocytes will increase in your lymphoid tissues, and this includes the tonsils. So this slightly unpleasant image is showing what the tonsils will appear like when they have mononucleosis. Remember, our tonsils are a lymphoid organ. They contain many lymphatic immune system cells that are going to fight off infections. And if they are overwhelmed, we can see the development of the kind of whitish film or fluid that accumulates on their surface. And finally, we have severe combined immunodeficiency disease, or SCID. Now, you may have heard of this in the news, and it's a common example that's used in biology education. But SCID is also known as the bubble boy disease and bubble baby disease. And you can see this child who is essentially in a spacesuit type of attire, if you will, and they're receiving filtered air here. And this is because CSID represents a group of rare and severe genetic disorders. It involves the body not containing a functioning adaptive immune response. So an individual is born without that adaptive immunity. The combined part that we see in its name refers to the fact that it wipes out both B and T cells, leaving the patient with no way to remember or specifically target invaders. Our third line of immune defense is the adaptive or specific immunity. And this involves those B and T cells, which can recognize pathogens that you've been infected with previously and create a biological memory, if you will. So if you're infected by the same pathogen again, you now contain a memory where you can more rapidly produce antibodies and fight off the infection faster and more efficiently. In individuals with SCID, they don't contain that adaptive immunity. And essentially, any infection is a new infection, even if it's the same pathogen that you've been infected before. So this puts children especially at an increased risk of severe infection. In a healthy person, the red bone marrow and the thymus produce and train millions of those lymphocytes, right? But in this particular disease, a genetic mutation stops this process. Now, because of this high risk of infection and because of the more delicate nature of the physiology of children, this disease is often associated with premature death. So children who develop or are born with, who are born with this genetic disorder often will experience premature death even within the first year of life. Historically, it was actually managed by very strict isolation to prevent exposure in the first place to environmental microbes. I believe there was even a popular movie that was based on this specific disease of a girl in a bubble, or the girl in the bubble. Maybe that's what it was called, if you will. Symptoms of this include recurrent life-threatening infections, so severe infection and immune responses, pneumonia, meningitis, sepsis, starting in as early as early infancy. And it can be identified by extremely low lymphocyte counts in newborn screening. There are, interestingly, some treatments, which I thought were quite intriguing upon researching. So this includes bone marrow transplant. So as we know, the bone marrow is the site of B and T lymphocyte production. And so the bone marrow transplant involves replacing the defective lymphoid tissue there with healthy stem cells that can hopefully learn to produce those lymphocytes that are healthy. And also a more emerging, developing treatment is gene therapy. So scientists are seeking out how to correct the actual genetic mutation in the patient's own cells to be able to treat this disorder. But treatments are still very much in the process of being understood and developed. So essentially, this disease is very difficult to treat, very difficult to manage, and has very significant consequences to those who are born with this genetic disorder. So this wraps up our investigation into lymphatic and immune system pathologies. Just as a summary here, as we've looked at the lymphatic system, we discussed the various anatomical structures that make up this system. So we looked at the primary and secondary lymphoid organs, and we looked at the actual function of the lymphatic system. So how it acts to take that interstitial fluid that accumulates in our tissues and eventually returns that fluid back to our circulatory system. And prior to this, it filters that fluid of any harmful pathogens or debris. So there's this close association with the circulatory and lymphatic system. Populating the lymphatic system is the cells of the immune system. These specialized cells are going to detect and neutralize any pathogens or foreign invaders. Again, we discussed those organs and each of their specific roles, and then we looked at some pathologies. Now with the endocrine system, and I'm just going to come back to the top here, we talked about the association, or similarities, I should say, between the endocrine and the nervous system, and how the endocrine system is the body's long-distance communication network between unique tissues. So there's always a releasing gland that releases the specific hormone, and a target gland or a target tissue or organ that responds to the hormone, causing some kind of effect. And the ultimate goal of the effects of these hormones is to maintain homeostasis, maintain that internal set point. So we looked at the various glands that make up the endocrine system, specifically focusing on the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, those master control centers being the hypothalamus that regulates various homeostatic functions in the body, as we can see with all of the hormones that it regulates through the hypothalamus pituitary connection here. We discussed the adrenal glands and their role in the stress response. And as we went through each of these specific glands, such as the thyroid gland as well, we looked at associated pathologies with these specific tissues. So I encourage you, as you go through these particular lecture videos, of course, to be mindful of the terminology that's associated with the structures, and in general, such a really important and great skill to develop as individuals who are interested in the health sciences is when thinking about or investigating a certain structure in the body, being mindful of or considering the why and the how behind how that structure functions and why it functions the way it does. And by answering these two questions, we can become better informed about certain pathological states. So if the typical function of this structure is, hijacked, or if it's malfunctioning, or if it's being blocked or miscommunicated, what might occur. And this is how clinicians and how researchers have been able to not only gain a better understanding of observed symptoms and pathologies, but also generate effective treatments for these certain diseases and pathologies. So I hope this lecture brought new insights to these particular systems, and that the pathologies were kind of interesting to explore and learn more about. And if you have any questions about any of this material, feel free to reach out via email. Happy to meet with you as always if you are interested in going over the material further. So take care and have a great rest of your week.